World leaders gathered in Munich over the weekend for the annual Munich Security Conference. Over the years, this has become the premier platform for discussing geopolitical and strategic affairs. This year too, with two active wars, one in Ukraine and the other in Gaza, there was enough on the plate of world leaders. But that is when another lightning blow struck. World leaders got news on Friday that Russia's longtime opposition leader and dissident, Alexey Navalny, had died in an Arctic prison while he was out on a morning walk. No specific reason was given for the cause of his death. In Munich, world leaders were left gutted and perplexed. The annual security conference suddenly became a funeral, a memorial for Alexey Navalny. In London, demonstrators projected a giant image of Navalny on top of the Russian embassy building. In Washington, an angry President Joe Biden called a news conference and he declared openly that Vladimir Putin was responsible for Navalny's death. But President Biden offered no proof to substantiate his claim. Rarely has the death of a single man summoned such a cascade of grief, anger, and of course demands from his people for justice. Many had feared the worst for Alexey Navalny for the last many years, ever since he returned to Russia in early 2021 from Germany. In Germany, he was poisoned and thought to be dead almost until he recovered from that illness. But the news of his death sent shockwaves across the world. World leaders were trying to wrap their heads around why this had happened and why now. Governments, however cruel and repressive they are, they often spare dissident figures. Look at Ai Weiwei and China. After all, no one wants to deal with a political martyr. Alexey Navalny could now go from dissident in life to martyr in death. While he was alive, Navalny was often compared to Nelson Mandela, the anti-apartheid leader who languished in prison for 27 years before emerging to lead a democratic South Africa. But Navalny could not do what Mandela did. He could not lead Russia into a democratic transformation. But even Mandela did not have to contend with a strongman, take no prisoners absolutist like Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Whether Navalny's death will reverberate throughout Russia, something which his life couldn't as much, is not yet clear. Even the circumstances of his death are still shrouded in mystery. There was only a cryptic report from a remote North Arctic prison saying that the 47-year-old convict had collapsed after a walk. His family has not received his body yet. His mother was told that her son died of sudden death syndrome. That was that. No further explanation. Much has changed since Alexey Navalny began his career as an opposition politician more than a decade ago. At the time he broke out onto the political scene, he was a charismatic figure who appealed to restless middle-class residents in Moscow. It was also the time when there was a political musical chairs going on between then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and then President Dmitry Medvedev. There was some hope back then that Putin might give up power after all. Those hopes turned out to be wishful thinking. Putin changed the Russian constitution, he returned as president, and has had 2 more terms since then. Navalny's appeal to democracy and to fight Putin's corruption machine had a much smaller audience. It did not resonate across the Russian heartland. So just like the Arab Spring back at that time, the Russian Spring too did not last long. Now, 10 years later, Putin is politically at his strongest. There are no rivals, either domestically in Russia or even exiled abroad, who can challenge Putin one day. His troops are back on the march in neighboring Ukraine. It's going to be 2 years this week since this war began, and there are no signs yet of Russia losing, despite the might of America and Europe thrown behind Ukraine. In fact, Russia has been recently emboldened by its victory in the key town of Avdiivka. Western leaders are contending with depleted interest in Ukraine, both in Europe as well as across the Atlantic in America. They're in particular among Republicans in the US Congress who are less inclined to fund Ukraine and its war effort. In fact, the Republican frontrunner in this year's election, Donald Trump, has been openly derisive of Ukraine, and his party colleagues on Capitol Hill have been holding up a $60 billion Ukraine defense spending bill. Efforts to build a genuine global coalition against Russia's war never really got off the ground. China, India, even Iran is continuing to do business with Moscow. Last June, South Africa eagerly welcomed Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at a meeting to discuss a new world order which is no longer dominated by the West. And yet, the tributes to Alexey Navalny have been pouring in. Flowers have been piling up at memorial sites around the world. Inside Russia, the police detained more than 400 people who dared to leave bouquets out in the snow. Some see a sliver of hope. Critics of Putin, howsoever few of them there are, and even fewer who are willing to speak publicly, are now hoping that Navalny's death could be a galvanizing moment. There is some hope across in America too. Some experts are hoping that Navalny's death would make it politically untenable for American lawmakers to be viewed as being accommodative of Putin, and that too in an election year. In the short run, it would also make it harder for at least some Republican House members in the US Congress to hold up additional military aid to Ukraine. Republicans have linked funding to Ukraine to more stringent measures against immigration from the southern border with Mexico. Western officials are hoping to press Russia for the release of other Russian political prisoners, the likes of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was sentenced to 25 years for treason last April. Whether or not such appeals would actually sway Putin, that is anyone's guess. Within Russia, it is harder to predict the long-term effect of Alexey Navalny's death. Putin faces far less popular resistance now than he did when Navalny began in politics. Putin is also operating in a world where his writ runs large. There are very few who can question him both inside and outside of Russia. While Navalny had sympathizers in the government, his loss deprives Russia of a Nelson Mandela-like figure. But even Mandela would have found it tough against a redoubtable opponent like Vladimir Putin. And now there is a newer problem to contend with. Navalny wanted to outlive Putin. He was hoping that a day would come in a post-Putin era where Russia might be open to democracy. And if it is, then he would be its natural torchbearer. Now he's a political martyr, one of many in Russia. And that is a harder story to sell. He was uniquely charismatic, he was a popular leader of the opposition, but there is now no obvious person who can take that baton from him, except perhaps for his wife. Navalny's widow, Yulia Navalnaya, was at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. On Friday, she took to the podium in Munich and said this to Putin and his friends, a message that was as clear as it gets. This is a message that will be heard in the Kremlin very loudly and very resoundingly. But will that message be heeded to? May not necessarily be the case.